The morning rose over the camp, casting a warm glow on the battlefield. The blue, indigo, and green soldiers moved among the wreckage, surveying the damage and attending to the wounded. The air was heavy with the smell of smoke and burnt plastic. The blue Lieutenant Smith walked through the camp, his eyes taking in the scene before him. The camp was in ruins, and the casualties were extensive. Medics worked tirelessly to provide aid to the injured, while others began the grim task of collecting the fallen and plastic body parts to use as resources for later. He approached a group of green soldiers huddled together, their faces weary but determined. They had fought bravely and stood their ground against the tan forces. The lieutenant's voice carried a mix of admiration and gratitude as he addressed them. "You have shown immense courage and resilience in the face of adversity. The Blue Dukedom and Indigo Volunteers stand with you as allies, and we are honored to fight alongside the Green Army. Together, we have repelled one of the Tan's invasion force and protected Greentop." The green soldiers nodded, their expressions reflecting a mix of exhaustion and gratitude. They knew the battle wasn't over yet, but the arrival of the reinforcements had given them a renewed sense of hope. The lieutenant turned his attention to the wounded, assisting the medics in providing care and comfort. He listened to their stories, their tales of bravery and sacrifice, and offered words of encouragement and support. Each soldier's life was a testament to the indomitable spirit of those who fought for their cause. As Greentop slowly began to regain some semblance of order, the Blue Lieutenant met with General Basin to discuss the next steps. They huddled over maps, strategizing and formulating plans to counter the Tan menace. General Basin pounded a fist on the table, his voice thundering as he spoke. "We cannot afford to let our guard down. The Tan forces will not rest until our Green Nation is turned to Tan," he declared. Lieutenant Smith nodded in agreement, while everyone else in the room stared at each other in silence. A few days later, the cry of a war horn was followed by the rumble of tanks and the screech of fighter planes. Dozens of Tan soldiers marched down the street, their boots stomping in rhythm on the pavement. They were accompanied by multiple vehicles rolling across the bridge that spanned from bank to bank over the river as it flowed out of town. The wind whipped through and tangled their banners into disarray. Supreme Commander Plastro stood atop a grandstand, arms crossed, observing the spectacle with a gleam of satisfaction in his eyes. Dressed in his elaborate tan military uniform, adorned with medals and decorations, he reveled in the glory of their recent success. The sounds of cheering and applause filled the air, amplifying his sense of accomplishment. He raised his arm in salute to show his appreciation for his fellow Tan countrymen, following protocol and celebrating his glorious victory with him. The cheers erupted higher and echoed off the sides of buildings. As the parade reached its peak, a messenger approached the Supreme Commander, bearing urgent news. Plastro's expression shifted, his curiosity piqued by the interruption. "Supreme Commander Plastro, I bring grave tidings. General Tannenberg has suffered a defeat in the assault on Greentop," the messenger announced as sweat dripped down his plastic face, his voice laced with a hint of apprehension. Plastro's triumphant demeanor faltered for a brief moment, his eyes narrowing as he absorbed the news. Greentop was a critical stronghold, and the failure to capture it struck a dissonant chord with him. However, he quickly composed himself, his face returning to his confident mask. "Defeat, you say? Very well. Inform General Tannenberg that I wish to see him immediately upon his return," Plastro ordered, his tone firm and commanding. The messenger nodded and hastily departed to carry out his orders, leaving Plastro deep in thought. Though his victory parade continued unabated, the news of General Tannenberg's setback cast a small shadow over his moment of glory. Plastro knew that he had to maintain the Tan Republic's momentum. No matter, Plastro thought to himself, a sly grin spreading across his face as he puffed on his cigar, gazing at the sky above. The Greens may have their victories, but they remain blissfully unaware of the great secret we hold. As the smoke from his cigar curled and dissipated into the air, Plastro's mind danced with the knowledge of the unknown power he had all over plastic nations. He took another drag from his pipe, savoring the taste of victory tinged with secrecy. The secret weapon was a closely guarded secret, known only to a select few within the Tan leadership. Plastro reveled in the power it bestowed upon him, the knowledge that he possessed something that could turn the tide of the war in an instant. Patience, he whispered to himself, his voice a low murmur in the wind. Their downfall will come, and they will tremble before the might of the Tan Republic. Plastro inquired on one of his aides, "How is our invasion of the Red Union progressing?" The aide reported back, "We have nearly taken all Red territories, but the Red Army is still putting up a fight." Plastro replied, "Excellent. Soon we will have access to more plastic to create new soldiers, weapons, tanks, and aircraft." Somewhere in Red territory, a Red city was in ruins. Dead plastic Red soldiers littered the streets and alleyways like broken toys. Destroyed and melted trucks and tanks lay in silent heaps with their crews still inside. Flames still burned from some of the buildings, casting a reddish hue to their surroundings. Some pieces of rubble were even smoking lightly. A light haze settled over everything, replacing the air with something close to fog, but not quite. The Red soldiers marched with hands behind their heads, escorted by Tan soldiers at gunpoint as they made their way through the streets, headed for captivity. Gunfire thundered across the city, now a battlefield. Bullets ricocheted off of plastic and glass, screaming as they struck. Chunks of concrete and asphalt were gouged away. The turncoat soldiers who remained fired into the opposing troops and refused to surrender, despite their superior numbers. The sounds were all drowned out by the mechanized patter of plastic treads, driving down the streets with Tan soldiers. "Surrender, you Red dogs!" Tan soldiers commanded as they fired at the Red holdouts. "Never, you Tan fascists! For the glory of our motherland!" cried a Red soldier as he ran towards a Tan tank with explosives strapped to his chest. Before he could reach it, a Tan soldier shot him, and he exploded in a shower of plastic fragments. The Tan brushed themselves off as if this was all part of their daily routine and continued moving through the streets looking for more Reds. Above a hill stood a small encampment. The words "Tan Headquarters" were painted on it in a yellowish tan paint. Tan soldiers ran around the post as jeeps and trucks entered and exited. Gravel paths ran between orderly rows of tents, many patched and well-worn, encircling a large tent that stood about 40 feet back from the path. Out in front of one tent, 2 Tan soldiers were by themselves when a scrawny old man stepped outside, not tan, he was gray, stretching his arms as he yawned. "Good morning," he said, with a tired voice that belied his simple tone. He started walking past the 2 soldiers, who both stood at attention. "At ease," he announced to the group. He glanced at the skyline before him, then started walking, and immediately the other troops jumped up, saluting him. The old man made no comment or gesture in response. He simply walked by without noticing them. The gray old man stepped into a Tan command tent and asked an aide for a cup of tea. He shot a glance around the Tan officers. "I see General Voronin Rubinchik is as stubborn as ever," he muttered. The aide nodded and quickly scurried off to fetch the old man's tea. The old man, whose name was General Helmuth von Otto from the plastic gray nation of Russia, settled into his seat at the head of the table. His eyes scanned the room as he waited for the others to take their seats. General Schmidt, a gruff man with a thick mustache, took a seat next to him. "General Otto," said Schmidt with a sharp nod of his head, "what's the situation with our troops in the city?" Otto took a sip of his tea before responding. "The city is in ruins. Our Tan forces are advancing, but we're facing heavy Red resistance." Schmidt grunted in response. "We need to push harder. We can't let the Reds hold us back." Otto nodded in agreement. "I've ordered the 5th Battalion to move in from the east, but they're facing heavy opposition from the Reds. We need to find a way to break through their lines." As they spoke, a messenger burst into the tent, panting heavily. "General Otto, we've captured a Red agent trying to infiltrate our lines. He has valuable information about their defenses." Otto raised an eyebrow. "Bring him in." Within minutes, the Red agent was brought before them. He was a tall man with piercing red plastic eyes. He glared at the Tan generals and Otto with contempt. "What do you want?" he spat. "We want information," said Otto calmly. "Tell us everything you know about where your Red comrades are located." The Red agent snorted. You think I'll betray my country? I'd rather die than give you anything useful. Take him to the interrogation room, commanded Otto while he sipped his tea. Ja nikoda ne pradam svoju stranu, fascist. As he was being taken away by the red soldier, shouted in his red language. What? Did you hear what he said? Said a tan officer. Otto's eyes lingered on the tan soldiers as they forced the red soldier into the interrogation room. He then returned his attention to his map of the city, noting where Red General Rubinchik and his remaining forces were located. Just as Otto was finishing discussing strategy with his men, another tan messenger burst into the tent. I have an urgent message for General Otto, he announced breathlessly. The messenger approached Otto with a look of urgency in his eyes. His hand shook as he handed Otto the sealed envelope. A message for me? Let's see now, Otto said, taking the envelope from the messenger's trembling hands. He broke the seal and quickly read the message inside, his eyes darting back and forth across the page. His face broke into a broad smile, and he laughed as he read the message. That fool Tannenberg has been defeated at Greentop, Otto bellowed. The tan officers in the room were stunned to hear about their esteemed general's defeat by the combined forces of Greens and Blues. Some simply sat in disbelief, while others muttered obscenities under their breath. They could hardly believe it. Had Tannenberg, their most disciplined commander, really been defeated by the Greens? As they began to comprehend what had happened, some of the officers started hastily jotting messages on scraps of paper to try and reverse this catastrophic loss. Ah yes, here is an order from Supreme Commander Plastro, Otto added as he read more of the message. Otto let out a wide smile as he realized that his journey to the Red Capital would have to wait, and instead, he was being summoned to the Tan Capital by Plastro himself. Well, what could Plastro have in mind? Said Otto as he turned to Schmidt. Schmidt replied with a seriousness in his voice. It could be anything, but I'm sure it's important. Otto motioned for the plastic soldiers under his command to get ready for their journey. Rising from his chair, he was almost out the door when a clap of thunder shook the tent, followed by a heavy rain. As he watched the soaked city outside, the Russian General Hamid von Otto sighed deeply before taking a breath and steeling himself for what was to come. What a wonderful time this will be, he muttered to himself. The Tan Capital. Tannenberg walked into the grand hall of the Tan Capital building, his plastic boots echoing against marble floors. Officers and politicians whispered in clusters, their eyes darting towards him with a mixture of pity and disdain. He had failed to capture Greentop, and the weight of that failure hung heavy. Plastro was waiting for him, standing next to a large, detailed map spread out on a table. Tannenberg took a deep breath before pushing open the heavy, ornate doors to Supreme Commander Plastro's office. The room was suffused with a muted light that filtered through the curtains, casting long shadows on the floor. Plastro stood at the window, his back to Tannenberg, looking out over the sprawling Tan Capital. Feeling the weight of his failure pressing down on him like a physical force, Tannenberg cleared his throat, ready to launch into an explanation, or maybe an appeal. Before he could utter a word, Plastro lifted his hand in a stopping gesture, still facing the window. Sit, Plastro finally said, his voice cold, without turning around. Tannenberg moved to sit in on one of the chairs in front of Plastro's imposing desk. His hands gripped the armrest, ready for whatever was to come. Plastro turned away from the window and locked eyes with Tannenberg. You failed, not just me, but the Tan Nation. Greentop was crucial. Tannenberg opened his mouth to speak, but Plastro cut him off. I don't want to hear your excuses or your plans for redemption. I've heard them before. Plastro continued, You didn't wait for it to be completed. Tannenberg's eyes widened. Sir, is it ready? Plastro picked up a cigar from a box on his desk, clipped the end, and lit it. He took a long, deliberate puff, letting the smoke curl around him before exhaling. His eyes met Tannenberg's as he broke into a cryptic smile, saying nothing. Just then, the door swung open, and Tan General Karl Felsenherz walked in, his presence filling the room. Gentlemen, he greeted, his eyes flicking between Plastro and Tannenberg. I hope I am not interrupting anything important. Plastro took another draw from his cigar, maintaining his composed demeanor. General Felsenherz, your timing is impeccable. We are just discussing the recent events at Greentop. Felsenherz's eyes shifted from Plastro to Tannenberg, and back again. Ah, Greentop. a situation that has become the talk of the capital. I trust there's a plan to rectify the failure." Tannenberg's face flushed with a sudden surge of anger. His hands clenched into his fists at his sides, and he had to take a deep breath to keep himself in check. "With all due respect, General Felsenherz, you weren't there. Those dirty blue dogs just had to come and ruin everything." Felsenherz looked squarely at Tannenberg, unfazed by the visible frustration. "That may be true, Tannenberg, but the battlefield is always unpredictable. You should have considered that before making your move." The room seemed to grow hotter, the air thicker. Tannenberg's plastic tan face turned into a shade of red, and his eyes narrowed dangerously at Felsenherz. Just as it seemed like the two men were on the verge of a shouting match, Plastro took a puff of his cigar and intervened. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice cutting through the tension. "Gentlemen, that is enough. This was but a minor setback." The room fell into a heavy silence. Both men looked at Plastro, their faces a mix of tension and remorse. Finally, Felsenherz broke the silence. "Forgive us, Lord Plastro." Plastro took another puff from his cigar, exhaling the smoke slowly as he considered Felsenherz's words. "Very well," he said, setting his cigar down. "We have much to discuss." He paused for a moment, letting his words hang in the air before continuing. "General Karl Felsenherz, I am assigning you to take command of the invasion of the Western Desert." "I accept, Lord Plastro," Felsenherz said, giving a curt nod. "Very well. Dismissed," Plastro replied. Felsenherz saluted, turned on his heel, and left the room, the door closing quietly behind him. Plastro looked at Tannenberg, who was still standing there, absorbing the implications of what had just occurred. "As for you, Tannenberg," Plastro began, picking up his cigar again, "we'll need to find a way to make up for your recent shortcomings." He took another puff, locking eyes with Tannenberg. "I have a special mission in mind for you, one that involves it." At the mention of it, Tannenberg's eyes lit up, with a sly grin spread across his face. "I'm all ears, Lord Plastro." At a tan airfield on the outskirts of the tan capital, a line of tan soldiers march across the tarmac in tight formation, the rhythmic pounding of their plastic boots echoing in the air. Parked in organized rows, fighter planes and bombers stand at the ready, while the distant revving of engines and shouted commands punctuate the atmosphere. All activity momentarily halts as this distinct sound of a descending aircraft fills the sky. A tan Junkers Ju-52 transport. Its wheels skid briefly against the runway. The plane taxis to a stop, and the door slowly opens up to reveal General von Otto. He steps down from the plane, his gaze sweeping over the tan soldiers, the aircraft, and the surrounding facilities. A car is waiting nearby, its driver standing at attention. As Otto approaches, the driver salutes. "General von Otto, welcome to the capital. We've been expecting you." Acknowledging the salute with a slight nod, von Otto gets into the car. As the tan vehicle pulls away on its way to the tan capital, von Otto leans back in his seat. His gray face is unreadable, a stoic mask that conceals his thoughts. In another area of the airfield, tan aircrews buzz around a series of Heinkel HE-111 bombers. Tan mechanics make last-minute adjustments, securing high-pressure cylinders of plastigas into the aircraft, while pilots consult their charts and navigators calibrate their instruments. The engines of the tan Heinkel bombers roar to life, one after another, filling the air with a powerful resonance. Tan crew members exchange final nods and gestures of readiness, then climb aboard their planes, buckling themselves in for the mission to come. As the first bomber taxis down the runway and lifts off, it is soon followed by the others. The tan ground crews look up, their faces a mix of pride and apprehension, as the formation of tan bombers fills the skies, their silhouettes growing smaller as they head towards their targets.